Making Decisions, a Christian Perspective. I'm Mike Zigarelli. How can Christians in leadership and management positions make decisions in a way that's faithful, in a way that's consistent with biblical principles? What can we do to preserve values that we consider non-negotiable, despite the time and budget pressures we might face, and despite the cultural norms in our workplace to do things a particular way? A decision tree is one time-honored tool that can help. It's like a flowchart, a graphically illustrated step-by-step process that reminds us of what questions to ask when making choices. In doing so, a decision tree slows us down. It brings circumspection into our decision-making process and ultimately generates creative options that we may have missed had we not used this tool. What are these questions we should ask? Personally, I'd recommend devising your own set that fits your theology and your circumstances. To stimulate your thinking, though, let me show you the set of biblically based questions that I used as a business school dean, along with their rationale. They're not intended to be normative for every Christian leader, but they were road tested and refined by a decade's worth of my Christian MBA students before I personally put them into practice. To evaluate almost any option, you might want to consider at least these 4 questions. First, we want to ask, is the option legal? It's axiomatic that we shouldn't break the law. Granted, it's possible that a higher law may mandate an exception, like when Jesus turned over the tables in the temple, or when Daniel in the Old Testament refused to pray to the Babylonian king. But those times will be exceedingly rare. Almost never in Scripture did God ask someone to break the law. In fact, the New Testament teaches in Romans chapter 13 that we're to submit to earthly authority. So, despite the temptations, if the alternative that you're considering is unlawful, well, just don't do it. But if that option does pass legal muster, next consider its impact on people. This is what we might call the servanthood test. If people are affected, can you really envision Jesus treating them this way? In an organizational context, we can think of servanthood as making a top priority of identifying and meeting the needs of individual stakeholders, like customers, employees, shareholders, suppliers, creditors, the local community, and so on. It means to conceptualize all people as children of God, created in His image, and to treat them with love and respect in every decision that we make. Jesus both teaches and personifies this principle in places like John 13, where Jesus washed the feet of His disciples, in Matthew 20, where Jesus taught that a godly leader is one who serves, and in the ultimate act of servanthood, His sacrifice for us on the cross. That's why in a faithful decision process, this servanthood test might be captured well with the question, if people are affected, can you envision Jesus treating them this way? This is a critical threshold question, a non-negotiable prerequisite for us. As imitators of Jesus, we shouldn't take any action that He wouldn't take. So options that don't pass this litmus test should send us back to look for better options that are more consistent with the character of Jesus. Which of these better options should we select? Well, that's where question 3 comes in. It's what we might call the stewardship test. Will the option we're considering, the one that just passed our servanthood test, also enhance organizational performance? Indeed, serving individual needs is a central virtue. At the same time, we need to remember that there's more to our faith than servanthood. On the job, God encourages us to never lose sight of the corporate good when we make decisions. The basic theology behind this is that everything belongs to God and that we're to manage, that is, steward, these God-owned resources in accordance with His will. In a business or nonprofit context, that would mean that Christian leaders are to act as stewards, not owners, of the resources placed at their disposal, and as such, they're to sustain and grow the organization He's entrusted to them. Under our care, 5 talents should become 10, and 10 should eventually become 100. However, we again have to be careful. Just as it's myopic to reduce Christian leadership to servanthood, it's also myopic to reduce it to good stewardship of the organization. Some well-intended Christian leaders have fallen into this trap, thinking, if we do right by the organization, we will have honored God in our work. In reality, though, that's a little like Boeing saying, the right wing of the plane is more important than the left, so let's cut costs by eliminating the left wing. That sort of aircraft would clearly never reach its goal. In the same way, Christian leaders do not reach their goal of godly decision-making through an unbalanced, steward-dominated approach. In fact, they ultimately crash the plane, rationalizing away the moral responsibility to care for individual stakeholder needs. Whether that stakeholder is an employee in need of more time off, or a prospective customer who wants the full story about your product, or a small supplier who can be coerced into reducing his price. An exclusive focus on the right wing of organizational stewardship abandons the left wing of serving individual needs, as Jesus would. Now, that doesn't mean, mind you, that servanthood always trumps stewardship. We can't do without the right wing either. Rather, it means that a definitive challenge for Christian leaders is to retain both ideals when making decisions, to affirm both servanthood and stewardship, and then to move forward with those decisions that pass both tests. Often we'll find that there's broad overlap here if we take the time to look for it. Still, one question remains. What do we do when there seems to be no overlap? When all the Jesus-like servanthood options appear to fail the stewardship test? That's when we ask question 4. Have you discerned from God how to resolve the tension between servanthood and stewardship? Veteran leaders will tell you they've experienced a lot of moral ambiguity during their careers. Often the choice isn't so much between right and wrong, it's between right and right. It's right to improve organizational performance, of course, but sometimes it's right to take action that may be nothing more than a cost to the organization. Giving away expensive product, as Merck has done for years with its drugs in developing countries, is one example. Another example is paying suppliers more than the market rate so that they can make a better living and contribute more to local economic development, as Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts do with their coffee farmers. Refusing to open on Sundays so that all employees are assured a day of rest, as Chick-fil-A does, is a third example. In each case, organizational stewardship submits to serving individual needs. There are other times, though, that the ideal of servanthood must submit for the sake of the organization. For instance, cutting loose a problematic employee who needs the job anyway. Or mass layoffs to remain solvent and competitive. Or requiring evening or weekend work to meet a critical deadline. The point is that for Christians, there will be times when, even though an option may not survive one of the litmus tests in the decision tree, it may still pass the biblical test for decision making. But how would we know? Frankly, not through a flowchart. Ultimately, any decision-making model that claims to be consistent with a biblical worldview must rely heavily on God for answers. Practically speaking, that means that we marinate every step of our decision-making in prayer and discernment. How much more necessary, then, is discernment when godly ideals seem to conflict with one another, when we are in one of those right versus right scenarios? It's especially at these moments that we need to reflect more deeply, to gather more advice, to recognize and reject any faithful misinterpretation of Scripture that we may have formerly embraced, and to substitute instead a humble, patient, and radical discernment of God's sovereign will, letting Him lead our leadership. We are to defer rather than to default, receiving God's direction on a case-by-case basis. Hence question 4. Have you discerned from God how to resolve the tension between servanthood and stewardship? If the answer is yes, then go forward in faith. If it's no, then if possible, don't move until the answer is yes. For sure, this more judicious approach to decision-making is not always swift, but importantly, neither is it hasty. Though it doesn't guarantee that we'll always make God's choice, it does remind us to always seek it.